In July of 1993, a father and his teenage son vanished during what should have been a simple weekend camping trip in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. Their camper was later discovered deep in the forest, abandoned, intact, food still fresh inside, but no trace of the two who should have been there. No footprints, no blood, just silence. For decades, the case has haunted locals, investigators, and family alike. Some say it was a crime. Others whisper something far stranger. What really happened to Michael and Erin Whitfield? Before we start, hit subscribe for more true crime deep dives. July 15th, 1993. Location: Bitterroot Mountains, Montana. The air that evening was cool, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. A faint wind whispered through the trees, bending the high branches and rattling the needles. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out once, twice, before silence swallowed the forest again. The camper sat nestled in a clearing, its tires pressed deep into the grass. A Coleman lantern glowed faintly through the side window, casting a pale amber light across the interior. Inside, 2 paper plates lay on the fold-out table, each with the remains of dinner: canned chili, crackers, and a half-eaten slice of apple pie wrapped in wax paper. Michael Whitfield, 38 years old, had been the kind of man neighbors described as steady. A local contractor, broad-shouldered, disciplined, but tender when it came to his son. Erin, 15, had inherited his father's quiet demeanor, but carried a restless energy in his eyes. This trip had been meant for them, a way to reconnect after Michael's messy divorce from Erin's mother. A father and son retreat, just a few days in the woods, no distractions, no arguments, just the two of them, campfires and stars. But now, the clearing was empty. The camper's door stood ajar, gently creaking as it swung. The lantern flickered. The chili had grown cold. On the counter, a small spiral notebook lay open. Its first few pages were filled with Erin's handwriting, messy, hurried, excited. Notes about the trail they had hiked earlier that day, sketches of animal tracks, a crude drawing of the camper under tall trees. The last entry was a single line, written in shaky script. "Dad says we saw someone watching us." Then, nothing. When rangers stumbled across the camper 2 days later, it was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Michael's wallet was still tucked into the pocket of his jacket, hanging by the door. Erin's Walkman sat on the bed, headphones coiled neatly on top. A pair of boots were left by the step, their laces undone, as if someone had slipped them off a moments before. But there was no sign of Michael or Erin. The surrounding ground offered no answers. The earth was firm, packed with needles and moss, impossible to track clearly. No footprints led away. No broken branches suggested a struggle. It was as if father and son had simply stepped out into the night and dissolved into the forest air. The investigation began quickly. Sheriff's deputies combed the area. Dogs sniffed the soil. Helicopters scanned from above. Divers explored nearby streams and lakes. Volunteers swept the woods in long, careful lines, calling out names that dissolved into silence. Nothing. In the days that followed, theories multiplied. Some insisted it was a murder-suicide, the father unraveling under the strain of divorce, dragging his son with him into oblivion. Others suggested an animal attack, though no blood or torn clothing supported it. A few believed Michael had planned the disappearance, intent on starting over somewhere new. But the most enduring whispers spoke of something else, something stranger. Campers who passed through the area in the weeks after reported hearing footsteps around their tents at night. A hunter claimed to have seen a man and a boy moving through the trees, silent as shadows, watching. A woman hiking alone swore she heard a voice calling for help, though no one was there when she followed the sound. Years slipped into decades. Leads grew cold. The Whitfield case joined the long list of unsolved disappearances that haunt remote landscapes. But the camper remained. Seasons weathered its paint, softened its tires, wore away its sheen. The forest crept closer each year, reclaiming what had been left behind. Moss climbed its edges. Ivy curled around its frame. Yet for those who stumbled upon it, tucked deep in the trees, the scene never lost its chill. Plates on the table, lantern on the counter, a notebook with one final trembling line. Dad says we saw someone watching us. And always the same question, echoing in the silence. Where had Michael and Aaron gone? July 17th, 1993. Location: Bitterroot Mountains, Montana. Ranger station and forest clearing. The call came just after dawn. Ranger Thomas Keene had barely rubbed the sleep from his eyes when the phone rattled on the desk of the Bitterroot station. A hunter on the line spoke in a steady voice, but Keene could hear the unease beneath it. He'd spotted a camper out in a clearing, door ajar, lantern still burning, even though the sun was up. It looked wrong, he said. It looked like the people who'd been there had simply walked away and never returned. By mid-morning, Keene was bouncing along a narrow dirt road in the back of a sheriff's department truck, the hunter's directions guiding them into a secluded stretch of the forest. The trees eventually gave way, and the clearing opened before them. The camper stood alone, streaked white and silver against the deep green backdrop, the door rocking slightly with each breath of wind. Deputy Carla Hughes shaded her eyes. "Doesn't look like it's been here long," she murmured. The tires were pressed into the grass, but the tracks hadn't yet disappeared into the earth. Keene stepped forward, circling the vehicle with deliberate care. No shattered windows, no dents or scratches along the siding. It wasn't wrecked. It wasn't vandalized. Just waiting. He climbed the step and nudged the door with one hand. It swung wider with a low creak, and the smell of cooked chili reached him immediately, faintly metallic, gone cold overnight. Inside, 2 plates rested on the fold-out table, each with half-eaten food. The cups of water beside them were still half full. A lantern flickered weakly on the counter, its fuel nearly exhausted. "Who walks away from dinner mid-bite?" Hughes whispered behind him. Keene didn't answer. His eyes were drawn to a leather wallet on the counter. Inside was a driver's license, Michael Whitfield, age 38, of Missoula. Cash still inside, credit cards untouched. At the rear, bunks were made up with sleeping bags. One was rumpled, sheets tossed aside. On the other, a Walkman sat neatly with headphones coiled. A notebook lay open on the table. He flipped through pages, filled with messy sketches and notes. Deer prints, pine cones, a rough drawing of the camper. The final entry stopped him cold. "Dad says we saw someone watching us." Deputy Scott Reeves appeared in the doorway, shaking his head. "No footprints outside. Ground's too hard, covered in needles. If they walked into the woods, we won't know where." By early afternoon, Sheriff Harold Klein had arrived. His presence filled the clearing, broad shoulders and gray at the temples. His expression that of a man who had walked into too many mysteries like this before. Orders were given crisply. Mark the camper as a primary scene. Photograph everything. Bring in the dogs and the helicopters. Search lines would comb the forest until every inch was covered. The work began in earnest. Volunteers and deputies spread out, radios crackling as they called to one another through the trees. The baying of dogs cut through the silence as they wove through underbrush. Above, the steady drone of helicopters scattered birds into the sky. Yet the forest gave nothing back, No jacket snagged on a branch. No flashlight dropped in panic. Back at the camper, Hughes cataloged items with patient care. Food in cabinets, maps on the dashboard, routes traced in pen. Circles marked places father and son had planned to visit. The clearing, she realized, wasn't on that route. By the time the sun began to sink, searchers returned to the station with empty hands. The weight of failure hung heavy over them. Keene walked the clearing again before dark, brushing at moss near the tree line. For a moment, he thought he saw the faint outline of a footprint, but the spongy ground refused to give him certainty. The sensation of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. He turned sharply toward the forest, but saw nothing but shadows among the trunks. The next morning brought a different kind of silence. Margaret Whitfield arrived from Missoula, clutching a photograph of her son and ex-husband. She looked smaller than her voice had sounded on the phone, pale and exhausted, yet her eyes burned with a sharp fear. "They were supposed to be home yesterday," she said, holding out the picture with trembling hands. "Michael promised me this trip was safe." Klein tried to soften his words, but there was no easy way to explain it. A camper found, food still on the table, belongings undisturbed, no sign of where they had gone. Margaret's head shook violently. Michael would never leave Aaron. Never. If they aren't back, something happened. When asked if anyone might have wanted to hurt Michael, her expression hardened. No debts, no enemies. But, she hesitated, her voice lowering. He said once, just weeks ago, that he thought someone was following him. I told him he was imagining things. I thought it was stress from the divorce. The deputies exchanged glances, none of them saying what they were thinking. That evening, Keene lingered again at the clearing. The others had packed up for the night, their radios fading into distance. The campers sat waiting in the half-light, doors still rocking in the breeze. He stepped to the tree line, called out once into the gathering dark. "Michael? Aaron?" His voice was swallowed whole by the forest. He stood there longer than he meant to, until the stars began to appear overhead, until the sensation of eyes upon him became too strong to ignore. He turned, but the clearing was empty. The campers stood alone, doors swaying like a slow pendulum. Inside, 2 plates of cold chili remained untouched. A lantern flickered its last flame, and a notebook waited on the table with its single chilling line. July 19th, 1993. Location: Ravalli County Sheriff's Office, Hamilton, Montana. The walls of the sheriff's office were lined with maps, Forest Service grids, county routes, faded topographical charts pinned up in layers. On the main board, Sheriff Klein marked the clearing with a red pushpin. Radiating out from it were concentric circles of search zones, each colored in with thick marker as the teams swept them clean. The circles grew day after day, but they remained empty. By the 3rd morning of the search, the office had the stifling atmosphere of a war room. Radios hissed constantly, the voices of deputies and volunteers breaking through with coordinates and negative results. Coffee cups stacked in corners, untouched meals went cold on desks. Klein stood with arms folded, staring at the map. "They didn't just vanish," he muttered, though he was beginning to wonder. Margaret sat at a side table, clutching her son's photograph as though it were a lifeline. She had hardly slept, refusing offers of a motel room. Her eyes followed every deputy who came through the door, searching their faces for any sign of news. Each time they shook their heads, something in her seemed to wither. Deputy Hughes approached quietly. "We've finished the second sweep east of the clearing. Dogs didn't pick up a scent beyond a few hundred yards. It just stops." Klein rubbed his jaw. "Bodies don't vanish. People don't vanish. Either someone took them out of there, Or they're still in those woods, hidden. The possibility of hidden remains hung unspoken between them. That afternoon, two detectives from Missoula arrived to assist. They began with Margaret. She answered their questions patiently, though her voice trembled when they asked about the divorce. Yes, Michael had been angry but never violent. Yes, he had insisted on more time with Aaron. No, she had no reason to believe he would hurt their son. When one detective asked if Michael had enemies, Margaret hesitated. She remembered the strange way he had spoken weeks before, convinced someone was following him. Though he had given no details, she repeated the story, watching their pens scratch across yellow notepads. The detectives exchanged a glance, but said nothing. Evening fell again, with no new leads. Search teams returned exhausted, boots muddy, faces streaked with sweat. They had combed streams, ravines, rocky outcroppings. Nothing. At the ranger station, Keene sat outside, smoking a rare cigarette. He stared at the line of darkening trees. The forest looked back at him, silent and endless. He thought about the notebook in the camper, the words written in Aaron's shaky script. "Dad says we saw someone watching us." He flicked the cigarette into the dirt and crushed it beneath his heel. He had spent his life in these woods, guided lost hikers out, calmed panicked tourists who thought every snapped twig was a predator. He knew the difference between paranoia and presence. That note felt like the latter. By the fourth day, rumors began to ripple. Hunters at a gas station whispered about strange lights in the forest. A woman claimed she had heard a boy's voice calling for help while hiking, though no one was there when she followed the sound. Others speculated about bears or mountain lions, though the absence of blood or torn clothing made that unlikely. Klein ignored most of it. He focused on facts, or tried to. But even he felt the weight of the unexplained. Back at the camper, forensic technicians finished dusting surfaces and bagging items for evidence. They found no fingerprints, other than Michael's and Aaron's. No signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. The scene remained frozen, like a photograph. On the evening of July 19th, Klein drove out to the clearing alone. He parked just beyond the tree line and walked the last few yards in silence. The camper loomed, pale in the fading light. He stepped inside, listening to the soft creak of the floor. The plates were gone now, sealed in evidence bags. The lantern had burned out, but the notebook still lay on the table. He opened it again, scanning the sketches, the scrawl of a boy eager to record everything he saw. His eyes lingered on the final line. The words seemed heavier each time he read them. When he stepped back outside, the forest was still. He lit another cigarette and leaned against the camper. A twig snapped deep among the trees. He froze, exhaled slowly, and listened. The sound did not repeat. Perhaps a deer, perhaps the forest settling, but he did not move until the last of the daylight was gone and the stars had begun to scatter overhead. The following morning, Margaret insisted on visiting the clearing. Deputies were hesitant, but Klein relented. She stood in the doorway of the camper, her hand brushing the frame as though touching a wound. Her eyes scanned the bunks, the counter, the table. She picked up the notebook carefully, tracing the writing with her fingers. "He was scared," she whispered. "Aaron doesn't write like this unless he's scared." "Could have been anything," Hughes said gently. "Maybe an animal." "No." Margaret's voice sharpened. "Michael wouldn't tell him something like that, unless it was real." She set the notebook down and stepped outside. Her gaze moved to the tree line, then lingered there. For a long moment, she stood silent, as if listening. Then she turned back to the deputies. "There's someone who knows what happened here. Someone was watching them, and maybe they still are." Her words lingered after she left, heavier than the silence of the woods. By the end of the week, the official search wound down. Helicopters returned to their hangars, volunteers went home, dogs were kenneled. The clearing grew quiet again. The case moved from active search to open investigation. But the camper remained. For Keene, for Hughes, for Margaret, it became a kind of anchor, a place they returned to in their minds, replaying every detail. 2 plates of chili, a Walkman on the bed, a notebook with a final trembling line. The unanswered question pressed down, like the weight of the trees themselves. If Michael and Aaron had walked out of that camper, why hadn't they ever come back? August 2nd, 1993. Location: Ravalli County, Montana. The summer heat had settled heavy across the valley, pressing down on the towns and farms below the mountains. For the Whitfield case, the weight was more than weather. 2 weeks had passed since the disappearance, and already the search effort was thinning to a skeleton crew. Officially, it was now a missing persons investigation. Unofficially, it was a mystery that the community could not stop talking about. At the cafe on Main Street, conversations drifted between coffee cups and plates of pie. Some swore Michael had staged it, driven into the woods to vanish with his son and start a new life. Others whispered darker things, that he had harmed the boy and himself, leaving their bodies hidden where no one would find them. More superstitious voices leaned on stranger ideas, cult activity, hunters gone wrong, something old in the mountains that had taken them. Sheriff Klein listened to none of it. He sat in his office with the blinds half drawn, the case file spread open on his desk. Inside were photographs of the camper's interior, close-ups of the plates of chili, the Walkman, the notebook. Every object catalogued, every detail measured. And still nothing explained the absence of the people who should have been there. The leads had gone cold fast. No suspicious vehicles reported on the nearby forest roads. No credit card activity from Michael since the morning they left Missoula. Aaron hadn't been in touch with friends. Their footprints ended where the clearing began. Deputy Hughes leaned in the doorway, holding 2 new witness statements. "Couple from Stevensville," she said. "They swear they saw a man and a boy walking the service road around dusk that same weekend. Man was tall, broad shoulders, wearing a plaid shirt. Kid had a red ball cap, matches their description. But by the time the couple turned around to offer a ride, they were gone." Klein took the statements, read them twice, and sighed. Everybody sees something when the papers print a photo. But what if they really did see them? Hughes asked. He rubbed his temples. Then the question is where they went next. Margaret was less patient. She had made the trip from Missoula 3 times in the past 2 weeks, demanding updates, refusing to accept that the trail was empty. When Hughes gently suggested she take time to rest, Margaret snapped back, "My son doesn't get to rest, does he? Not until I find him." On her latest visit, she insisted on speaking at length about Michael's state of mind. He wasn't planning to disappear. He had jobs lined up, clients waiting. He was putting money aside for Aaron's college. Her voice broke. He wanted to prove he could be a good father, even after the divorce. Klein tried to assure her they were doing everything they could. But Margaret saw the truth in his eyes. The longer the silence stretched, the slimmer the chances became. The forest itself seemed to swallow time. When Keene returned to the clearing in early August, the grass had already begun to rise around the camper's wheels. The air inside smelled stale now, the chili long removed, but the memory of it lingering in the metal. He stood in the doorway, notebook in hand, and copied the last entry again in his own handwriting. He didn't know why. Something about the boy's words haunted him, the tremor of the letters, "Dad says we saw someone watching us." It was the kind of line that burrowed beneath the skin. Each time he read it, he pictured different scenarios. A hunter crouched in the shadows studying them. A stranger drifting through the forest, curious and dangerous. Or something more elusive, eyes that couldn't be traced to any face. Night came earlier in the mountains as August wore on. A few searchers still walked the trails in the evenings, though now more out of stubbornness than duty. Around campfires, they told one another small stories of unease, hearing twigs snap when no one was near, catching a glimpse of movement at the edge of vision. One man admitted he had dreamed of the camper, sitting inside it, while the door creaked open slowly, though he could not see who stood outside. The case began to migrate into the newspapers in a new form. Features rather than reports, speculation rather than updates. Father and son. Mystery deepens. One headline read, "Abandoned camper still haunts investigators." Reporters called the sheriff's office daily. Klein stopped taking their questions. On August 10th, a volunteer hiker stumbled into the clearing by accident. He had been out searching trails alone, stubbornly unwilling to let go of the story. Later, when he gave his account at the station, he swore the camper door had been closed when he arrived, though investigators had left it ajar the week before. He said the air inside felt colder than it should have, as though someone had been there recently. The deputies chalked it up to imagination. But when Keene went back the following day, he found faint impressions in the dirt just outside the door. Not footprints exactly, more like disturbed patches of pine needles, not deep enough to measure, but fresh. He told himself it was just animals nosing around, yet the unease lingered. By the end of August, the case file grew heavier with dead ends. Witness statements, search maps, photographs, all layered with uncertainty. Margaret returned once more, sitting across from Klein with her hands folded tightly. "People don't just vanish," she said, echoing his own words from weeks earlier. "Somebody knows something, and if you can't find them, I will." Her determination shook him. She was not speaking from denial, but from a fierce certainty. It reminded him of the camper itself, standing in the clearing no matter how many days passed, refusing to explain itself. When she left the office, Klein looked again at the photographs spread on his desk. The empty plates, the Walkman, the notebook. Each image was like a riddle missing its last piece. He tapped his pen against the table, then pushed the file aside. The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky bruising into twilight. Out in the mountains, the clearing grew dark. The camper sat still, its thin walls holding secrets against the press of the trees. And somewhere in the silence, the question remained. If Michael and Aaron had walked away, what had they seen looking back at them from the woods? October 12th, 1998. Location, Ravalli County, Montana. The leaves had turned by the time the anniversary came again. 5 years since Michael and Aaron Whitfield vanished. 5 years since the camper was found, in that silent clearing. The world had moved on, newspapers filled with other tragedies, but for those who had walked the clearing that July, the case never really ended. Sheriff Harold Klein sat behind his desk, the case file spread open, the way it always seemed to be this time of year. His hair was thinner, his eyes lined with the years, but the photographs still cut sharp as ever. The plates on the camper's table, the Walkman on the bed, the notebook with the last trembling line. "Dad says we saw someone watching us." He stared at the words until the edges blurred. Outside, the sound of traffic drifted faintly through the office window, a reminder that life carried on, whether mysteries were solved or not. Deputy Carla Hughes entered quietly, setting down 2 cups of coffee. She had been with him since that first day in the clearing, her hair now streaked with gray, though she was not yet 40. She knew better than to ask what he was thinking. Instead, she pulled up a chair and opened her own file copy. "Anniversary calls are starting again," she said. "Local paper wants a quote. Radio station too. Same as every year." Klein groaned. "They want a ghost story, not answers." "Maybe," Hughes said softly. "But people remember. That counts for something." Margaret Whitfield had not let anyone forget. For 5 years she had written letters, called reporters, organized small vigils on the courthouse lawn. Every October, she placed a notice in the Missoula Gazette with Michael and Aaron's photographs, urging anyone with information to come forward. Each year, fewer tips arrived, and those that did were half-whispers, rumors retold, until they lost shape. But she never stopped. That autumn, Margaret drove again to Hamilton, standing in the sheriff's lobby with the same photograph clutched to her chest. The deputies knew her now, greeted her gently, ushered her into Klein's office. She looked older, her hair cut shorter, lines carved deeper around her mouth, but her eyes still burned with the same determination. "They were 15 and 38 when they disappeared," she said, voice steady. "Aaron would be 20 now. I need to know if he's still out there." Klein leaned forward. "Margaret, we've chased every lead we had. There's nothing new." "Then find something new," she snapped. "Somebody saw them. Somebody knows what happened. You can't let it sit in a folder forever." Hughes shifted uncomfortably. "We've had new tools since '93. DNA testing, databases. If we had remains, we could—" She stopped short at Margaret's sharp look. "I don't want bones," Margaret said. "I want my son." The silence stretched. Finally, Klein nodded. "We'll reopen the file. Give it another push." And so the investigation flickered back to life. Detectives interviewed old witnesses, tracked down the couple who claimed to see a man and boy on the service road. Their story hadn't changed, but their memory had blurred around the edges. The man still swore. He saw the plaid shirt, the boy's cap. The woman hesitated. "It could have been them, but I can't be sure anymore." They pulled Michael's financials again. No activity since July 1993. His bank accounts sat frozen, untouched. Aaron's school records likewise ended that summer. Technicians examined the camper again, now rusting in an impound lot. Dust coated the surfaces, spider webs in corners, but the evidence tags still clung to the cabinets. They swabbed for DNA, hoping new technology might reveal something unseen before. But all they found were Michael's and Aaron's profiles. No stranger, no intruder. The case refused to yield. By winter, momentum dwindled. The reopened file slid back onto the shelf. But something remained changed. For investigators like Hughes and Keene, the camper became a ghost that trailed them. Each time they drove forest roads, each time they answered calls about lost hikers, the memory of that clearing stirred beneath the surface. The forest itself carried the legend now. Hikers who passed near the site whispered about it, even if they didn't know the details. "That's where the camper was," they'd say. "The father and son who never came back." Some claimed to have seen shadows moving between trees. A tall man and a boy, always just out of sight. Others said the camper door sometimes appeared shut, sometimes open, depending on the day. By 1998, the story was no longer just about Michael and Aaron. It had become something larger, a reminder that the forest could still keep its secrets. Margaret carried the weight, harder than anyone. That winter, she moved closer to Hamilton, renting a small house on the edge of town, so she could be nearer the sheriff's office. She said it was to be available. But Hughes knew better. Margaret wanted to be close to the mountains. She wanted to be near the place where her son had last been seen, as though proximity might anchor him to her somehow. She visited the clearing more than once, though deputies advised against it. She would stand at the tree line, hands clenched, staring at the rusting shell of the camper that had been left to decay. Once, Keene found her there at dusk, her silhouette rigid against the fading sky. He approached gently, but when she turned, her eyes were wild, feverish. "I heard him," she whispered. "I heard Aaron calling." Keene wanted to tell her it was imagination, the way grief could sharpen silence into voices, but something about the certainty in her tone unsettled him. He walked her back to her car in silence, the forest pressing close around them. Years would pass, but Margaret's voice would echo in his mind. "I heard Aaron calling." On the 5th anniversary, the Gazette printed another story. It carried the same photographs, the same basic facts, but it ended with a line that struck Hughes hardest. "The camper still stands in the clearing, waiting." She thought about that word, waiting, and felt a chill she could not explain. The Whitfield disappearance was no longer just an investigation. It had become a story, a place, a presence that seeped into the valley's bones. And though the file grew dusty, the mystery remained alive in the shadows of the Bitterroot Mountains, patient as the trees themselves. September 14th, 2009. Location: Bitterroot Valley, Montana. The morning light spilled across the valley in muted gold, haze rising from the river like breath. 16 years had passed since Michael and Aaron Whitfield vanished, and still their case remained lodged in Ravalli County's files, like a splinter that refused to work free. Sheriff Harold Klein was long retired now, his badge tucked away in a desk drawer at home. The case had outlived his career, though not his memory. He sometimes woke in the night, with the sound of the forest in his ears, the creak of a camper door swinging in the dark. But the file no longer sat on his desk. It belonged to the new generation now. Detective Rachel Moreno, 36, had taken charge of cold cases when she transferred from Missoula the year before. Sharp-eyed, meticulous, she carried herself with the quiet intensity of someone who believed in patterns, in evidence, in science that could catch what instinct could not. When she opened the Whitfield file that autumn, she felt the weight of time in its pages. The photographs were yellowing, the ink faded, but the core of it remained unshaken. 2 plates of chili, a Walkman, a notebook, and then absence. Moreno ordered the evidence transferred from storage. The camper, long since hauled from the clearing, sat under a tarped shed at a county impound lot. Rust had eaten at its frame, moss crawled up the tires, but inside the tagged items remained. She donned gloves and stepped inside, inhaling the must of decay. The table where father and son had last eaten was scarred but still there. She touched the edge gently, half expecting to feel warmth. She sent swabs from the surfaces for new DNA testing, hoping technology had caught up where the 1990s had failed. She had them dust and scan the notebook again, searching for latent prints in the pages. She even ordered luminol across the camper floor, watching under black light for traces of blood. Nothing. It was almost cruel, the way the camper refused to speak. Margaret, now gray-haired but still fierce, was the first to hear about the renewed attention. She had aged, yes, but her obsession had not softened. She drove to the sheriff's office the day the story hit the local paper. "You're really working it again?" she asked Moreno, voice tight with hope and suspicion. "We're reviewing it," Moreno said carefully, "going back through everything with fresh eyes, testing evidence with newer methods. Sometimes cold cases give when you press in the right spot." Margaret leaned forward. "Then find the spot, because I've been pressing on this wound for 16 years, and all I have are scars." Moreno respected her persistence. Most families had long since surrendered to grief, or moved away from the place of disappearance. But Margaret had remained, tethered to the valley, as if her son's presence still clung to the trees. Moreno pulled the Whitfield file and flipped through the early statements. Her breath caught when she found the note. Aaron wore a red cap when they left Missoula. The lab confirmed it within a week. The fibers matched clothing manufactured in the early 1990s. Embedded in the lining were traces of human DNA. Male. The degradation was heavy, but it aligned with Aaron Whitfield's profile. After 24 years, the case had a new piece of evidence. The announcement rippled quickly. Local papers ran the headline, "Hikers Find Possible Link to Whitfield Disappearance." Radio shows speculated. Margaret, now in her 60s, gave another interview, her voice wavering with both hope and despair. If it's Aaron's cap, then he was out there in those woods all this time. Somebody left him there. The sheriff's office organized a new search. Drones scanned the ridges. Teams of deputies and volunteers combed ravines using ground-penetrating radar where the soil looked disturbed. For weeks they worked, uncovering animal bones, old trash heaps, abandoned fire pits, but nothing human. Still, the cap gnawed at them. It proved Aaron had been farther from the clearing than they thought. It proved he had walked or been carried deeper into the forest. Moreno returned often to the site where the hikers had found it. She stood among the trees, staring at the logs and brush, listening to the trickle of snowmelt. It was quiet, but not empty. The sensation of being watched pressed down, just as survivors of the original search had described decades earlier. She crouched at the base of a pine, brushing aside needles, imagining footsteps, a boy stumbling, a man guiding him, another figure watching. The stories collapsed into one another until she could no longer tell whose memory she was holding. Margaret visited the site once as well, against Moreno's advice. She stood at the flagged location, staring at the cap in its evidence bag. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch the plastic. "This was his," she whispered. "He loved that hat. Wouldn't take it off, not even at dinner." She lifted her eyes to Moreno, sharp and burning. "This proves he lived beyond that camper. You have to find the rest." But there was no rest to find. The searches thinned again. The forest closed in, indifferent. Through the summer of 2017, Margaret called almost daily, pressing for updates. Moreno had little to give her. Each time, Margaret's voice grew more frayed. "He's out there," she insisted. "Even if it's only bones now, he's out there." In August, the Gazette ran another story. This time, it was less hopeful. "New search ends without trace of Whitfields." The article quoted an unnamed deputy, saying the case was like chasing ghosts. Margaret cut the page out, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the photograph of her son on her nightstand. Moreno couldn't let it go, either. She kept the cap in her office drawer longer than protocol allowed, opening it late at night, when the station was empty. She studied the cracked bill, the faded stitching, the broken strap. She imagined Aaron pulling it low over his eyes, scribbling in his notebook, unaware that it would one day be the only piece of him left in the world. She drove the mountain roads alone, retracing the original paths. The clearing where the camper once stood was now swallowed in young trees, but she could still see it in her mind, sharp as the day she'd first opened the file. A table with plates of chili, a lantern burning, a boy's notebook with a final line. "Dad says we saw someone watching us." By autumn, the search had gone quiet again. The cap was boxed in evidence, the case file fatter, but no closer to an ending. Life in the valley moved forward. Leaves fell. Snow returned. But the Whitfields remained in the woods. On the evening of October 12th, the 24th anniversary, Moreno found herself unable to leave the office. The file sat open, the cap resting beside it. The photographs fanned out, like cards in a hand. She studied Michael's face, mustache thick, smile wide. She studied Aaron's, boyish and bright, wearing that same red cap. She imagined them stepping out of the camper into the twilight woods, Michael with his hand on his son's shoulder, Aaron glancing nervously into the trees. Somewhere out there, eyes watching. She whispered into the empty room, "Where did you go?" And though no one answered, she felt the silence press in, as though the forest itself had leaned closer to listen. March 9th, 2021. Location: near Lost Horse Creek, Bitterroot Mountains. The thaw came sudden that year. Heavy snowmelt poured off the ridges, swelling creeks until they boiled with runoff. Along the washed-out banks, earth gave way. Roots tore loose, stones shifted. It was a fisherman who found the bones. He had followed Lost Horse Creek upstream, casting for early trout, when his boot struck something pale protruding from the mud. At first he thought it was driftwood, stripped by the current, but when he bent closer, he saw the curve of a skull, eye sockets filled with silt. The fisherman stumbled back, breath tight in his chest. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and called 911. By that afternoon, deputies had sealed the area. Moreno arrived as forensic techs erected tents against the drizzle. She pulled on gloves and stepped carefully down the bank. The creek foamed loud in her ears, but beneath it, the world seemed hushed, reverent. The skull was small, too small to be a grown man. Within hours, more fragments emerged, a partial ribcage, long bones scattered, soil washed from their cracks. A tangle of faded cloth clung to one femur, threads of denim, the size of a teenager. Moreno's throat tightened. She crouched beside the skull, brushing dirt gently from the brow ridge. 28 years of silence, and here at last was an answer. The lab confirmed what her gut already knew. The DNA matched the Whitfield family line. After nearly 3 decades, they had found Aaron. The news spread fast. Headlines filled local papers, then regional, then national. Remains identified as boy missing since 1993. Margaret, now 71, collapsed when Moreno came to her door with the confirmation. She pressed both hands to her face and sobbed so violently, Moreno had to steady her by the shoulders. "My boy," she whispered, "my boy." They buried Aaron that April in Missoula. Margaret chose a plot beside her parents, beneath a maple tree. The service was small, private. Just a handful of relatives, old friends and detectives who had carried his file across the years. Moreno stood in the back, head bowed. But for every answer, more questions opened. If Aaron's body had lain by the creek since 1993, why had it never been found? Had the snowmelt dislodged it from a hidden grave? And where was Michael? Search teams combed the area through spring. Cadaver dogs sniffed ridges and ravines, alerting twice, but finding nothing more than deer bones. They mapped the coordinates of Aaron's discovery, compared them to the old search grids. The creek had run high that summer in '93. A boy's body could have been hidden easily beneath flood debris. Still, something gnawed at Moreno. Aaron had been found alone. No sign of Michael. No indication of how the boy had died. No weapon, no trauma. Clear from the bones. Margaret demanded answers too. Her grief was sharp, but behind it burned fury. "You found my son," she told Moreno one evening, her voice ragged. "But where's his father? Did Michael do this to him? Or did someone take them both?" Moreno had no reply. Theories erupted again. Some claimed Michael had killed Aaron and vanished. Others argued the opposite, that Michael had died protecting his son. his own remains still hidden in the forest. Online forums dissected the case, spreading maps, grainy scans of the notebook page, photographs of the cap. Strangers argued late into the night about what the boy had seen in the trees, but only Margaret lived with the raw wound. She visited Aaron's grave daily, laying fresh flowers, speaking to him softly, as though he were still a boy who needed comfort. Sometimes she lingered until dusk, staring toward the mountains, lips moving in prayer or rage. Moreno, too, could not leave it alone. She returned again and again to Lost Horse Creek, crouching at the bank where the fishermen had found the skull. She tried to imagine the boy stumbling here, disoriented, maybe calling for help. She tried to picture Michael with him, or someone else guiding him. The forest offered no reply. In July, flood season passed. A second discovery came. A pair of hikers moving through a side ravine, north of the creek, stumbled upon scraps of cloth, tangled in underbrush. They reported it, and deputies retrieved the fragments, the remains of a plaid flannel shirt, faded almost colorless, but with enough pattern left to identify. Michael Whitfield had been wearing a plaid shirt when last seen. Nearby, buried shallow beneath a cairn of stones, they found a wallet. Inside, waterlogged but intact, was a driver's license. Michael Whitfield, born 1955. But no body. The discovery twisted the case into darker knots. Michael's personal effects near Aaron's remains suggested they had been together. Yet his bones were nowhere. Had he died elsewhere? Been carried away? Or had someone moved him deliberately, piece by piece erasing his trace? For Margaret, the implications were unbearable. They were together, she told Moreno, clutching the damp wallet as though it might yield warmth. Whatever happened, they were together. She refused to believe Michael had killed their son. Her certainty wavered only in private moments, when she sat awake at her kitchen table, staring at the artifacts, cap, wallet, photographs, as if they might rearrange themselves into a clearer picture. Autumn fell heavy that year. The trees burned gold along the ridges, and with them came a kind of mourning across the valley. The Whitfield case was no longer just mystery. It had become history, written into the land itself. People spoke of it in lowered voices, with the weight of inevitability. But Moreno felt something unfinished, something still hidden beneath the surface. One evening in October, she returned once more to the clearing, where the camper had stood nearly 3 decades earlier. She parked on the dirt road and walked in as dusk settled. The grass was high, the trees thicker now, but she could still trace the outline of where the camper had rested. She stood in the silence, letting the forest press close. Then she whispered, not knowing why, "Aaron, Michael, where did you go?" A wind stirred through the branches. For a moment she thought she heard movement, a soft shift deeper in the woods. She waited, pulse sharp, but the sound faded. Still, the feeling lingered as she walked back to her car, that the forest was not finished with its secrets, that something, whether truth or ghost, still waited in the shadows, watching. February 4th, 2022. Location: Hamilton, Montana. Winter pressed down hard that year. Snow layered the valley like ash, muffling the roads and bending pine boughs beneath its weight. The world seemed suspended, quiet but brittle, the way it sometimes felt just before glass broke. Detective Rachel Moreno sat at her desk long after the others had gone home. The Whitfield file spread open before her. The evidence bags lined up like silent judges. The red cap, the wallet, scraps of plaid fabric. Each piece was a bone in a skeleton that refused to assemble. She closed her eyes and pictured the scene again. Lost Horse Creek, the skull rising from mud, the denim clinging to bone. Then the cairn of stones, hiding Michael's belongings. Together but not together. Found but not finished. She rubbed her temples until the skin ached. Some cases refused to die, and this one had taken root inside her, threading through her thoughts like ivy. Even in sleep, she dreamed of the forest, endless trees, the creak of a camper door, voices just out of reach. Across town, Margaret Whitfield sat at her kitchen table, with the same artifacts laid out before her. She had insisted on copies of everything, photographs, reports, even the DNA summary confirming Aaron's bones. She studied them nightly, her hands trembling with both devotion and fury. "Michael didn't do this," she whispered to the empty room. "He would never hurt Aaron." Sometimes she spoke louder, as though daring the shadows to contradict her. "He was a good man. You hear me? A good man." The townspeople spoke differently now. In diners, in barber shops, in the hushed aisles of the grocery store, the Whitfield disappearance had become more than tragedy. It was folklore. Parents warned children not to stray too far into the pines. Hikers told each other not to linger near Lost Horse Creek. They said the forest still held them. One night, over coffee in a dim booth, Deputy Carla Hughes leaned across to Moreno. "People are saying Michael killed his son," she murmured. Moreno shook her head. "We don't know that." "They don't care about what we know," Hughes said. "They want a story they can hold on to. Father kills son, disappears in woods, neat, clean." "Except it's not," Moreno said. "We don't have his body. We don't have cause of death. All we have are fragments." Hughes stirred her coffee absently. Sometimes fragments are all people need. But fragments weren't enough for Moreno. She drove the roads alone at night, headlights slicing through snow. She returned to the clearing again and again, standing where the camper once sat, the hush of trees pressing in. Each time she felt the same thing, a presence just beyond reach, watching. Margaret's grief became more erratic as the year turned. She began visiting the sheriff's office unannounced, demanding updates, slamming her hand on the counter when told there were none. She carried a folder of her own, clippings, letters, handwritten notes, thrusting them at deputies as if they might contain a clue everyone else had missed. "Look at the dates," she told Moreno once, voice sharp, finger jabbing at circled numbers. "Every October, something happens. A sighting, a tip. Now this, Aaron found in spring, Michael's wallet in summer. It's not random. Someone's playing with us." Moreno tried to reason with her, but Margaret's eyes burned with something that looked almost feverish. "You don't understand," she said. "I still hear him. Aaron. At night. Like he's calling from the woods." It was the same thing she had told Keene 20 years before. The media returned in waves after the bones were confirmed. Reporters trailed Margaret outside the grocery store. Cameras glinted through snow at the courthouse steps. A documentary crew arrived from Seattle, asking to film the locations. They interviewed Margaret beneath the maple tree at Aaron's grave, her voice breaking as she said, "He was just a boy. Just a boy." They interviewed Moreno too, though she hated the glare of lights. "Do you believe Michael is still alive?" the journalist pressed. Moreno paused too long before answering. "We don't have evidence either way." It aired weeks later, edited to make her hesitation look like doubt. The valley erupted in speculation. Some said Michael had killed Aaron and escaped. Others whispered he was dead too, his body hidden where the forest refused to yield it. A few claimed he still walked the ridges, older now, a ghost of flesh and bone, watching from the trees. Moreno stopped watching the news after that. In late February, another discovery came, though it yielded only more unease. A hunter turned in a knife, he had found lodged in a hollow log near Lost Horse Creek. The blade was rusted, pitted with age, but faint traces of dried matter clung to the hilt. Forensic testing identified it as human blood, too degraded for full profiling, but consistent with both Whitfield's. The knife was bagged, logged, photographed. Margaret demanded to see it, her voice trembling when Moreno refused. "They used that on him," she said, clutching the arms of her chair. "On my boy." "We don't know that," Moreno replied. "The blade's too damaged to say how it was used." But she thought of Aaron's bones, weathered and incomplete. She thought of the missing pieces that might have shown trauma, and her stomach turned. That night, she dreamed of the camper. The lantern burned low. 2 plates of chili sat cooling, and from the tree line, a shadow leaned forward. By spring, the case consumed her fully. She requested more funding, more man-hours, more searches. She rewalked the maps, drew lines between the clearing, the creek, the cairn of stones. She convinced herself there was a pattern waiting to be seen, if only she pressed hard enough. Hughes pulled her aside one evening. "You're burning yourself out, Rachel. This case, it doesn't want to be solved." Moreno's voice was flat. "Cases don't want anything. People do." Still, when she drove home that night, she caught herself glancing at the ridges, where the trees stood black against moonlight. She could almost believe Hughes was right, that the forest itself was guarding something. Margaret, meanwhile, slipped further into obsession. Neighbors reported seeing her walking into the woods alone after dark, flashlight swinging. Once, deputies had to escort her back, her boots soaked, her hands numb from cold. She told them she had heard Aaron calling. By autumn, whispers spread that Margaret was losing her grip. Some pitied her, others avoided her entirely. In the valley's folklore, she became another character in the Whitfield story. The mother who never stopped listening to voices in the trees. But in her kitchen, late at night, she whispered a vow over the faded wallet and red cap. "I will not let you stay lost. One way or another, I'll bring you home." October 11th, 2023. Location: Bitterroot Mountains, Montana. The forest was already dark by late afternoon. Clouds pressed low against the ridges, mist rising from the undergrowth like smoke. Detective Rachel Moreno hiked slowly, boots crunching over fallen needles, her breath clouding in the cooling air. She had told herself she was finished with the Whitfield case. After 30 years, after bones and fabric and knives, she had promised she wouldn't let it consume her anymore. But anniversaries had their pull. She reached the old clearing just as the wind shifted. The spot where the camper had once rested was almost invisible now, swallowed by young pines and thick brush. Yet Moreno could still see it clearly in her mind. The table with plates, the lantern, the notebook. She closed her eyes, and for a moment the scene was whole again. She almost missed the sound. A dull metallic clang, faint but distinct, like iron striking stone. She froze, listening. Another clang followed, closer this time. She moved carefully through the brush, heart quickening. The sound led her down a narrow game trail toward a dry wash. There, half buried in the soil, she saw the edge of something unnatural. Corrugated metal, rusted and bent. She crouched, brushing dirt away, until a square outline emerged. It was a hatch. Her first thought was of an old hunter's cache, maybe an abandoned root cellar. But when she tugged at the handle, the hatch groaned open, and the smell that rose was not of earth or roots. It was old air, stale and sour, sealed too long. She radioed for backup, voice tight, then waited, staring at the black mouth gaping beneath her boots. By nightfall, the area swarmed with deputies, floodlights burning white against the trees. Crime scene techs lowered themselves by rope into the narrow shaft. When the first one came back up, his face was pale. "There's a room down there," he said. "Concrete walls. Looks like someone built it." "What's inside?" Moreno asked. The man swallowed. "You need to see this yourself." She descended slowly, the rope burning cold in her hands. The chamber opened around her, a rough square carved into earth, walls lined with concrete slabs. The ceiling was low, the air stifling. Her flashlight beam caught shelves along one wall, cans of food, rusted lanterns, a stack of blankets stiff with mildew. Then she saw the chair. It stood in the center of the room, bolted to the floor. Leather straps dangled from its arms. Beside it lay a small wooden box. Inside the box were items so ordinary they made her stomach twist. A deck of playing cards, a comb, a folded scrap of plaid fabric. And on the far wall, scrawled in faint graphite, a name repeated over and over. Erin, her knees weakened. She lifted the light higher. The writing filled the wall, layered upon itself, hundreds of repetitions, some jagged, some trembling, as though scratched out in desperation. She stumbled back, hand covering her mouth. Deputies found more as they cleared the chamber. A rusted cot, chains fixed to the wall, a notebook with water-warped pages. Most were unreadable, ink blurred into stains, but one page held a legible line. "Dad says we have to be quiet. He says they're still listening." Moreno stared at the words until her vision blurred. 30 years of silence, and here it was. A voice carried through time, trapped underground. By dawn, the site was sealed, the evidence catalogued. The chamber was dated by its concrete mix, likely poured in the late 1980s or early 1990s. No permits, no record. Someone had built it deliberately, hidden it carefully. News of the discovery spread faster than fire. Helicopters circled overhead. Reporters crowded the trailhead. The headline blazed across national screens. "Underground bunker. Found linked to Whitfield disappearance." Margaret collapsed when Moreno brought her the news. "They kept him," she whispered, clutching at her chest. "They kept my boy down there." The valley shifted again, rumor boiling into frenzy. Some said Michael had built the chamber himself, holding Erin captive before disappearing. Others claimed both had been prisoners, father and son trapped by someone else. Moreno spent nights poring over the evidence. The bunker yielded no fingerprints beyond degraded partials, no clear DNA beyond Erin's. Whoever else had been there had worn gloves, cleaned carefully, or time had erased them. But the writing on the wall haunted her most. The name repeated, scratched over and over, as if the boy had tried to carve his existence into stone itself, refusing to be erased. She carried that image with her everywhere, in the quiet of her office, in the hush of her car, in the stillness before sleep. She heard the faint rasp of pencil on concrete. Again and again, the chamber raised more questions than it answered. How long had Erin been held there before he died? Where had Michael gone? Was he prisoner, captor, or victim? And who had sealed the hatch so carefully that it stayed hidden for 3 decades? The forest had spoken at last, but in riddles. And somewhere deep in her gut, Moreno felt the chilling certainty that the Whitfield story was not yet finished. November 14th, 2023. Location: Ravalli County Sheriff's Office, Montana. The evidence room smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, an antiseptic silence hanging over the shelves. Detective Rachel Moreno stood at the long table where the items from the bunker had been laid out. Each piece sat in its sealed bag, catalogued, tagged, frozen in the stillness of procedure. The wooden box, the deck of cards, the plaid scrap, the warped notebook with its blurred ink, and the photographs pinned beside them. Concrete walls scrawled with a boy's name, straps dangling from a chair bolted to stone. Moreno rubbed her temples. Weeks had passed since the discovery, and still the chamber bled into her sleep. She heard the pencil scratching on concrete. She smelled mildew, rust, air trapped too long underground. Forensics had worked every angle. The concrete mix dated to the late 80s or early 90s. The shelves had been stocked with canned goods from brands discontinued by 95. The leather straps bore faint impressions of a child's wrists, deep enough to suggest repeated restraint. But there were no prints, no hairs, no fibers beyond errands. Whoever built that place had been careful, or else time itself had scrubbed the traces away. The notebook, when dried and analyzed, yielded only fragments. The line Moreno had read on that first night was clearest. "Dad says we have to be quiet. He says they're still listening." Other pages carried partial phrases. "Don't cry, light hurts. He'll come back." And once, a word repeated in shaky hand. "Door, door, door." She showed them to Margaret in a quiet office, bracing for the storm. Margaret took the papers with trembling hands, reading each blurred line aloud, as though invoking them might summon Aaron back. Then her face hardened. Michael didn't write this. He was with him, protecting him. Someone else built that place. Moreno stayed silent. The truth was more slippery. Some phrases sounded like a boy echoing his father's comfort. Others felt darker, rehearsed, instructed. Margaret's voice rose. "You think Michael did this? You think he strapped his own son to a chair?" "No," Moreno said gently. "I think Michael was there, but we don't know in what way." Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "He was a good man. He loved Aaron. Don't you dare." Her voice cracked. She turned away, clutching the papers to her chest as though they were scripture. The following days brought more tests. The scrap of plaid matched the fibers from Michael's shirt, found years earlier in the ravine. The knife from 2022 bore trace proteins that could not be ruled out as his, yet there was no body. The speculation grew fevered. Online forums exploded. Michael as captor. Michael as fellow prisoner. Michael as sacrifice. Reporters hounded the sheriff's office daily. Was the chamber a survival shelter gone wrong? Was it a torture site? Was Michael Whitfield the architect? Moreno gave no answers. At night, she drove the mountain roads, pulling over near trailheads, staring into the black pines. Sometimes she thought she saw shapes shift between trunks, as though the forest itself was keeping watch. One evening, Hughes joined her at the bar, their jackets still damp from snow. "You look hollow," Hughes said, studying her glass. Moreno managed to laugh with no humor. "Maybe the forest is eating me too." "Rachel," Hughes said, serious now, "sometimes cases become mirrors. You stare long enough. You see yourself, not the truth." But Moreno shook her head. "This case, it's not just fragments. It's something whole. Something we keep circling but can't name." The circle widened days later when the lab called with a new result. One of the rusted food cans bore a faint fingerprint, preserved in grease under the label. Too partial for a match in state systems, but distinct enough to analyze. Moreno sat with the techs as they lifted the ridge detail onto film. The whorls stared back at her like a coded spiral. She ran it through federal databases. Hours later, a possible match pinged. A drifter arrested in Idaho in 1991 for burglary, released and never heard from again. The man's name was Charles H. Danner. Moreno stared at the file photo. A gaunt man with hollow cheeks, eyes flat as stone. No record after 91. No death certificate, just vanished into the West. She pulled Michael's photo beside it. Different men. but something about their placement on the desk made her skin prickle. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. Had Danner built the chamber? Had Michael stumbled across it? Had they crossed paths that summer of '93 in ways no one had imagined? She brought the lead to Margaret, careful with her tone. There may have been someone else involved. A man named Charles Danner. He was in Idaho in the early '90s. His prints were found on one of the cans. Margaret gripped the table. So Michael didn't do it. You see? He didn't. It means someone else was there, Moreno said. But it doesn't erase Michael's role. We still don't know what happened. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though her jaw clenched with defiance. He protected Aaron. I know it. That's the truth. But truth was a word that slipped like water through fingers. The bunker remained sealed, a crime scene preserved. The chamber haunted every deputy who had stepped inside it. One called in sick for a week afterward, plagued by dreams of scratching walls. Another transferred entirely, saying he could not walk the woods without hearing whispers. Moreno visited once more, before winter sealed the trails. She descended slowly into the stale air, her flashlight sweeping the concrete. The name still sprawled across the wall. Aaron, Aaron, Aaron. As though refusing to fade, she stood in the silence, listening. And for the first time, she whispered aloud the question that had grown heavier with each new piece of evidence. Michael, were you a prisoner too? The chamber offered no answer. Only the drip of water from stone, the groan of rope as she climbed back into the night. Outside, the forest loomed black, endless. Somewhere beyond those trees, Michael Whitfield's body, or his secret, still waited. And Moreno knew she would not stop until she found it. May 27th, 2024. Location: Bitterroot Mountains, Montana. The thaw came late, but when it arrived, it stripped the mountains raw. Meltwater tore down gullies, snapped branches, rolled boulders the size of cars into creeks. Every spring, things long hidden surfaced: antlers, old hunting gear, sometimes bones of elk that had fallen in deep snow years before. That morning, a hiker called in from a ridge above Blodgett Canyon. He had seen what looked like cloth, flapping from a rock slide, half buried in scree. Deputies were dispatched, and within hours, the sheriff's office sealed the area. Moreno arrived as the sun dropped low, turning the granite walls of the canyon red. She climbed slowly toward the flagged site, her pulse quickening with each step. The cloth was plaid. Wedged in the rocks, tangled with roots, was the remains of a shirt sleeve, the same faded pattern as Michael Whitfield's. Nearby, in a shallow crevice, shielded from the elements, a human femur jutted from the soil. The recovery took days. Teams sifted carefully, documenting each bone, each scrap of fabric, each rusted button. By the end, they had most of a skeleton, weathered but largely intact. Dental records confirmed what Moreno already knew in her gut. The remains were Michael Whitfield's. The news spread like lightning. 31 years after vanishing with his son, Michael had been found. Margaret collapsed when told, clutching the framed photograph of her ex-husband and son. At the funeral, though, she placed that photo atop his coffin. Her voice broke as she whispered, "You tried to protect him. I know you did." But Moreno couldn't let it rest. The bones told a story, though fragmented. Forensic anthropologists noted healed fractures on Michael's ribs and wrist, older injuries consistent with blunt trauma, and one fresh wound, the left side of his skull, fractured with violence. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. Not accident, not exposure. Violence. The shirt remnants yielded trace residues, metallic, faint, but consistent with rust, possibly the same as the knife found 2 years earlier. Moreno pored over the files in silence. Michael had been killed. The question was by whom? The drifter's name resurfaced. Charles Danner, a ghost in the records. Arrested once in Idaho, then vanished, his fingerprint on a bunker can. No trace since 1991. If he had built that chamber, had he kept both father and son? Had Michael died trying to protect Aaron? But the notebook line gnawed at her. Dad says we have to be quiet. He says they're still listening. It suggested complicity, or protection, or both. She sought out Margaret again, careful with her words. Michael was found, Moreno said. He died of head trauma, likely inflicted by someone else. Margaret's eyes shone with tears, but her jaw tightened. Then, he was a victim too, just like Aaron. Moreno hesitated. We can't rule out that he... Don't, Margaret cut in sharply. Don't you dare. He loved Aaron. He died for him. Died. The certainty in her voice shook Moreno more than doubt ever could. The investigation widened. Teams scoured archives for traces of Danner, aliases, old addresses, mugshots in other counties. They found a P.O. box in Salmon, Idaho, registered in '94. A motel receipt in Spokane, same year. After that, nothing. No death certificate, no arrests, no record of crossing a border. It was as though he had stepped into the trees and dissolved. Yet the forest still seemed to whisper his name. One evening in June, Moreno drove alone to the bunker site. The hatch was sealed now, crime scene tape fluttering. She descended the slope and crouched at the hatch, resting her hand on cold metal. In the dusk, with the pines sighing overhead, she whispered, Michael, what did you see? What did you do? The wind stirred, carrying a faint echo through the trees. For a moment, she thought she heard scratching, like pencil on concrete. Then silence. That night, she dreamed again of the camper. 2 plates of chili, the lantern burning low, a notebook open on the table. In the dream, a shadow leaned close, whispering, they're still listening. When she woke, the phrase echoed in her chest like a warning. The Whitfield case was closer to an ending now, yet somehow further than ever. They had bones, artifacts, names, but not truth, not the shape of what had happened in those woods. And Moreno felt it pressing in, urgent now, as though the forest itself was pushing her toward the final revelation. Something was still waiting to be uncovered, something that would explain not just how Michael and Aaron had died, but why the forest had kept their secret for so long. August 3rd, 2024. Location: Ravalli County, Montana. The mountains lay heavy with heat, their ridges shimmering in the haze. Grass crackled underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from distant wildfires. Yet it was not fire that pulled Detective Rachel Moreno up the old forest road, but the whisper of unfinished things. She carried a box in the trunk of her car. The red cap, the knife, the fragments of Michael's shirt. Objects that had clung like burrs through 3 decades of searching. Margaret Whitfield rode beside her, silent, her hands clasped in her lap. At 72, her body was thinner, her skin drawn tight, but her eyes burned with the same fierce fire Moreno had seen from the start. This is where it ends, Margaret said softly, as though promising herself more than Moreno. The site was high above Lost Horse Creek, a ridge rarely visited. Moreno had studied the maps again and again. The lines converged here. The bunker to the east, Michael's remains to the west, the creek where Aaron's bones had surfaced running below. A triangle of silence. Deputies had swept the ridge earlier that summer, but Moreno had pressed for one more search. Not for bones, she told them, for what ties it together. The air was thick with pine resin as they began. Moreno moved methodically, grid by grid, eyes scanning for what did not belong. Margaret trailed, pausing often, her breathing shallow in the heat. After 2 hours, Margaret stopped. "There," she whispered, pointing. At first Moreno saw only brush and stone. Then, half buried in the soil, she caught the glint of rust. They cleared it carefully. What emerged was a steel box, the size of a footlocker, edges corroded but intact. It had been buried deliberately, stones stacked to disguise it. The lock was brittle with age. Moreno pried it open with a crowbar. Inside lay a collection of artifacts, carefully arranged, preserved against time. A photograph, water-stained but clear enough, Michael and Aaron beside the camper, smiling. A child's drawing, a stick-figure family, Dad plus Aaron plus Mom, scrawled in uneven letters, a set of keys, and beneath them, a stack of papers bound with twine. Moreno's hands shook as she lifted them free. The first page was Michael's handwriting, slanted, urgent. "If this is ever found, it means we did not make it out. My name is Michael Whitfield. My son, Aaron, is with me. We were taken in October 1993 by a man named Charles Danner. He pretended to need help. I thought I was doing the right thing. I was wrong." Margaret clutched the box edge, her breath catching. Moreno read on. "He brought us to a place he had built, a room underground. He said it was for survival, but it was a prison. No, he chained Aaron. He told me to keep him quiet, to tell him lies so he wouldn't cry. I did what I had to. I told him they were listening, that he had to be brave. I thought if I played along, Danner would spare him." The words blurred as Moreno's eyes stung. She forced herself onward. "I tried to fight. He broke my wrist. He laughed when I begged. I don't know how long we were there. Days, maybe weeks. Then he took Aaron away one night. Said he wanted him to see the stars. I never saw my son again." When the sheriff invited her to speak, she stepped forward slowly, the cane clicking against stone. Her voice trembled, but carried. "They were gone a long time," she said. "For years, all I had were questions. Did they suffer? Did Michael hurt Aaron? Did he abandon us? People asked me those things too. They whispered, and I carried it like a stone in my chest." She held up the paper. "But then this was found. His words, his truth. He tried. He fought for our son. He died trying. I need you all to know that." Her voice broke then, and she pressed the paper to her lips before lowering it again. "Don't let their story become only fear. Remember them as father and son. And remember that we still don't have justice. The man who took them is still out there, or his shadow is. And I don't want him forgotten either. Not because he deserves it, but because memory is the only weapon we have against men like him." Silence followed. Even the reporters didn't speak. Only the wind rustled through the fog. When the ceremony ended, Margaret stayed behind. She traced the bronze letters with her fingers, lips moving in silent prayer. At last she turned and walked away slowly, her figure fading into the mist. Detective Rachel Moreno lingered too. She hadn't worn her badge today. She stood at the back, arms folded, watching the crowd disperse. In her pocket was a photograph she had never shown anyone. It was from the evidence file, taken inside the bunker before the chamber was sealed. The wall scrawled with Aaron's name. The letters jagged, desperate, endless. She kept it not as proof, but as reminder that some stories never leave you, that the silence of those mountains had claimed more than 2 lives. It had claimed whole decades of searching, grieving, waiting. The official record now said the Whitfields were victims, that Charles Danner had built the chamber, taken them, killed them, that he had vanished into the wilderness, a ghost who might never be found. But at night, when Moreno lay awake, She doubted, because in Michael's letter, there was one final phrase, faint, almost illegible, written sideways along the margin. He said he wasn't alone. The words gnawed at her. If Danner had partners, if someone else had helped, then the valley still carried secrets. She had petitioned to keep the case open, technically active. But the sheriff had signed it to cold files again. "We've gone as far as we can," he said. Yet Moreno knew she hadn't. She still drove the back roads some nights, pulling over to listen. She still walked to the hatch in the trees, though it was welded shut now. She still dreamed of the camper, the lantern's glow, the shadow leaning forward to whisper, "They're still listening." And she believed it. Because in towns like Hamilton, in valleys like the Bitterroot, memory and myth became indistinguishable. Stories lived on, long after. The people in them were gone. The Whitfields were proof of that. Aaron's name was carved now in bronze, but it was also carved in concrete underground, repeated 1,000 times by a boy desperate not to vanish. Michael's name was honored in public, but in private, it lingered as question and ache. Victim, father, man who tried. And Danner, whether dead or alive, still haunted the ridges. Sometimes hunters swore they saw a figure slipping between trees, gaunt and gray-haired. Sometimes hikers spoke of hearing faint tapping in the night. And sometimes, when the wind carried just right, parents shushed their children with a story. "Don't wander too far, or Danner will find you." Moreno didn't dismiss it anymore. She knew too well how the forest swallowed truth. One evening in late October, after the plaque ceremony had faded into memory, she drove back to Blodgett Canyon. She parked at the overlook, where Michael's bones had been found. The air was sharp, the stars brittle above. She sat on the hood of her car, listening to the creek roar in the darkness below. And she whispered into the night, "I heard you, Aaron. I heard you, Michael. I'm still listening." The wind stirred. The pines shifted. And in that moment, she could almost believe the forest had whispered back,